Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, depending where you are. And welcome to the Future of Financial Information webinar series. So today is our last event of the season, and what a season finale it is. So it's a great topic, cross-sectional return predictability. So one of the key topics in finance, and also, unsurprisingly, with hundreds of published papers on this topic, and topic which has recently also been at the center of a active debate as to whether we can actually trust these findings or whether we have a so-called replication crisis in finance. And so it's especially great that we have two speakers here who are very much at the center of the debate. So Andrew Chen, who will present his paper. And if you look at the title, it sort of gives away a bit his view on the replication crisis. But he will spend the first 30 minutes giving us his reasons for his view. And we also have Dacheng Xiu as well, who also has contributed to this debate. And so he will spend the following 15 minutes giving his view on Andrew's view. And finally, I'm sure many of you in the audience also have a view on this debate and on the replication crisis. So we are also very much looking forward to the Q&A session during the last 15 minutes of the webinar. But if you have a question, you don't need to sit on it until the very end. Please post it in the chats. I will be monitoring the chat as the host, and I will make sure that your question, we get back to your questions after the presentation and the discussion. And if we go beyond the 1 hour mark, that's also great. We always have reserve some time after the official parts to continue the discussion in an informal setting. So without further ado, Andrew, please take it away. The screen is yours for the next 30 minutes. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Michał. As usual, I'm from the Federal Reserve, so these views are just mine and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve System. Let me get this thing started. All right. So as Michał mentioned, researchers have discovered hundreds of cross-sectional predictors. And at the same time, researchers, many of them, are very concerned that these discoveries are false. Why would we be concerned about these being false? I think this is put best by Jensen and Bennington in this one sentence. Given enough computer time, we are sure that we can find a mechanical trading rule which works, right? That is, if you torture the data long enough, if you hack it long enough, it'll tell you something. It'll tell you something even though there's nothing really there. And what's notable about this quote is it's from 1970, so this is like that old joke about like the young generation always being like the worst generation. You can find that going back to the Vedas. Now, what this paper does is it adds to the mounting evidence that these discoveries are surprisingly largely true. This mounting evidence, I think, is well described in McLean and Pontiff 2016. Now, that paper is often cited for saying that anomalies decline after they're published. But it also says, like right in the abstract, that in the first few years out of sample, the returns are still 75% there. So that suggests that the discoveries are largely true. I have a paper with Tom Zimmermann and Raps where we follow up on McLean and Pontiff and show like an empirical Bayesian argument for why that happens. And in a forthcoming paper, Jensen, Kelly, and Peterson, they have a nice synthesis of all of these issues. Now, what's new in this paper then is a really simple argument. It's really simple. It's so simple, it only takes 5 slides. And so then the other 18 slides reconcile in somewhat excruciating detail with Harvey, Liu, and Zhu. And so my apologies for it being perhaps a little excruciating later. So I just want to have your attention for the next 5 slides. Please try to stay with me and focus for the next 5 slides. All right, slide number 1. Well, the first thing we want to do is get a nice formula for the false discovery rate. Okay, the first thing to do before you can have a false discovery rate is you want to define a discovery. Let's call discoveries t-stats with greater than 2. Straightforward, right? T-stat greater than 2 is a discovery. And then as long as the t-stats are well behaved, as long as basically a law of large numbers works, you have this really simple expression for the FDR. Okay, this simple Bayesian kind of expression. The FDR is just the probability that your predictor I is false, given that your predictor has a t-stat big enough to be a discovery. That's all it is. As long as things are well behaved, you get this nice and simple intuitive formula. In fact, you might as well define the false discovery rate this way, and many people do it this way. They call it an empirical Bayes or a Bayesian false discovery rate. Okay, once you have this nice Bayesian formula, you can apply Bayes' rule. That's the second line here. This is just Bayes' rule. And then you note that probabilities are less than 1. So you can kind of assume the worst case, just say that, let's just assume for the worst case that this kind of prior is the worst possible outcome or setting. Okay, and then you see a really simple formula for the FDR, or for an upper bound on the FDR. The numerator here is just the p-value. And the denominator is the empirical right tail. In other words, if your distribution of t-stats, if it looks like this, and then at some point there's a number 2 on the x-axis, then this area is what you want to divide by down here. And we're just basically comparing the standard normal distribution tail to what we see in the data. Just compare those two. How far is the data compare to the standard normal, to this idea that there's no predictability out there? Okay, so that's the easy part. The hard part is actually publication bias. Multiple testing is arguably not an issue at all. Like there's some philosophies of statistics that says we should just test everything, just report everything, and just thoroughly explore the data. As long as we do the statistics right, it'll all be okay. I mean, that's kind of what the previous slide suggests. As long as we account for everything, the whole distribution of t-stats, we know what to do. The problem is that if you count the share of published t-stats greater than 2, if you look at the empirical data on that denominator, this is going to be about 100%, right? You can see it here. Actually, here is more like 95%. But of course, there's missing stuff here, right? Like another way to put this is you can see this in the JF. This is in the RFS. But here, all this stuff is in C:/file drawer. And in order to properly calculate this, we need to find out what's going on over here. Now, I'm going to suggest 2 ways to find out what's going on there. The first is a completely non-parametric solution, and it just takes advantage of what other scholars have already done. In particular, Yang and Zheng in their RFS paper, they take CompuStat accounting variables, everything that's there that is not full of missing data, and they create 18,000 long short strategies based off of that. Just basically, let's just systematically mine everything in CompuStat. And they find that if they mine everything in CompuStat, at least 20% of strategies have t-stats greater than 2. Then we need to make an assumption. Okay, this assumption, I hope people are comfortable with this. Let's assume that we researchers are not worse than this random mining. That is, we don't actively destroy value. We can at least take random CompuStat variables and decide which ones are more likely to work than others. Just not worse than random mining. Then, as long as we're better than random mining, then this 20% forms a lower bound on this denominator, and therefore we get a lower bound. We get an upper bound on the FDR. You just divide that 5% by 0.2, and you get 25%. So that says at least 75% of findings are true. So that's the first simple argument. And I want to underline at least, because if you remember, when we were doing the Bayesian formula, we had the probability, this is an upper bound because over here, there's a probability that a random predictor is false. And then we assume the worst case. So this is still kind of a worst case setting that of 75% being true. Now we don't want to rest everything on one RFS paper. It's an excellent paper in my opinion, but we don't want to put everything on it. An alternative solution is to do extrapolation by fitting what we see in the right tail. Okay, and this one is nice because Harvey, Liu, and Zhu in the appendix of their paper, they provide such an extrapolation. In fact, this blue line that is from Cam Harvey's presidential address, that is shown in Cam Harvey's presidential address, is exactly this extrapolation. If you look at the appendix of Harvey, Liu, and Zhu, they test several specifications, and they always find a mean for this exponential distribution of around 2. I find the same thing in the Chen-Zimmermann data. You can see why it works so well, because why it's so robust is because this tail here is really, really close to an exponential. And it's pretty remarkable that you can actually replicate these Tstats from scratch and you still get the shape. And a property of the exponential distribution is it's memoryless. So no matter how you cut it off, as long as you estimate it properly, you're going to get a mean about 2. So it's robust. The other good thing about this extrapolation is that it's conservative. If you keep following out the extrapolation, it's going to go all the way up there. And so that means that the stuff in the file drawer has a big mode at 0. You know, in other words, the typical finding in your file drawer, in that C:/file drawer, has absolutely no predictability even in sample. It's kind of conservative, as in you could think of another way of extrapolating. You know, another natural way to extrapolate is to think that, as with most distributions, you have a peak somewhere. You know, this will lead to kind of the idea that, you know, researchers actually have some power at predicting stuff, more power than that conservative assumption. Anyway, it's conservative, it's robust, and it's also easy to plug into the formula. If you just plug in the exponential distribution in for this thing down here, you just get x of 2 divided by 2, and you get 5% times e, which is 2.72, and you get an FDR of at most 14%. So this also very different approach, but it still finds that most discoveries are true. And I'd like to just kind of illustrate that you don't even need to do any of these kind of fancy extrapolations or calculations. If you just look at this, you know, this compared to this whole, if we extrapolate out like this, you know, just kind of do it by hand, it looks like the mass here is about 1/3. And so that means you have to divide 5% by 1/3, you multiply by 3, and you get about 15%. So in other words, these two very simple calculations, they can explain why it is that the FDR is so low in cross-sectional predictors. And the overall intuition is just that if you compare what you see in the data to a standard normal distribution, the standard normal will look something like this. It just plummets around here. And then after 4, you can't even see it. You know, this mass is 5%. You know, that's just tiny compared to any way to extrapolate from the observed data or compared to just randomly mining Tstats. Okay, so that's the message of the paper, but we need to reconcile with Harvey, Liu, and Zhu, and we need to do this in a lot of detail because this is an extremely influential paper. This paper has 1,000 citations, or more than 1,000 citations, even though it was only published about 5 years ago. And the influence continues to grow. In fact, these two snapshots were taken about 2 months apart. So this paper gets another citation every year. So next year, at the end of next year, it's likely to have like 1,600 citations at this rate. This paper is also a favorite of influential scholars. It won the RFS Editor's Choice Award. And if you ask David Hirschleifer, what is your favorite paper discussing this file drawer effect? He'll say that it's dots in the cross-section of expected returns. Harvey, Liu, and Zhu say that given that there's so much data mining going on, they say this very famous line, I think, most claimed research findings in financial economics are likely false. Okay, so we need to examine this because it seems like my results conflict with HLZ. You know, the title of the paper is that most findings are likely true. But I'm going to show you that surprisingly, the results don't conflict, at least not the numerical results. Like written results are open to interpretation, but the numerical results we can check, we can compare. So HLZ's main numerical result isn't about the false discovery rate overall. Their main numerical result is that the t-hurdle should be raised from 2.0 to 3.0. That's in the abstract. It's very clear. Without other details, it's hard to know what this means about the FDR. So we'll have to take a closer look. Okay, so this is HLZ's main figure. This kind of takes us back in time. Like if you're in 1993 here, we have HML and SMB are published, and you know there are many other. Apparently, there's about 30 other. You can see on this axis, there's about 30 other factors published at this time. And then these lines here show different Tstat thresholds that HLZ calculate. These thresholds use a variety of methods. But let's take a few at a time. There's the solid blue and the dotted line. These two measure the family-wise error rate. If you're not familiar with the family-wise error rate, that means the probability that you find at least one false predictor. It's pretty distant from the false discovery rate. So I'll argue that these lines really can't tell you directly what percent are false. This green line, the dashed green line over here, this does measure the FDR. You know, you can see it right there that the BHY is a multiple testing procedure that controls the false discovery rate. But you have to choose an upper bound on the FDR when you do this algorithm. In this line, you can't tell from this figure here, but they use a FDR maximum of 1%. What that means is that anything that falls over here is 99% plus true. So then what happens over here? It can't tell you. So it still doesn't say a lot about what is the false discovery rate. But if you dig into the text, you can see that they consider more generous false discovery rates. They say if you change the maximum FDR to 5%, the corresponding Tstat threshold is 2.78. So then that begs the question, how many Tstats exceed 2.78 in HLZ's data? You can find out by simulating their SMM estimates. That's what I do in my JF paper. And you find that the number is about 70%. And if you just eyeball this figure, you know, this looks like it's about 70%, I think. Okay, then you just kind of take these numbers together. For 70% of findings, the false discovery rate is less than 5%. That means that even if everything else is false, even if all of this is false, the overall FDR is at most 33.5% because you can only get about 5% of the rest of it being false. So in this sense, our results agree. I think our findings all show that the false discovery rate overall is less than 30-ish%. That is most, the majority of findings are true. There's a caveat is that we disagree on the estimation method. Okay, so this takes a bit of explaining, but at the same time, this explain hopefully can help you understand where these formulas come from and what the false discovery rate means. Okay, so both papers there's no disagreement on what the false discovery rate is. False discovery rate is this Benjamin A. Hochberg expression, which in principle, it depends on the Tstat threshold, and this could be stochastic, which can make things complicated. But on the right-hand side, it's the number of discoveries that are false divided by the number of discoveries. It's intuitive, the false discovery rate. And then we take the expectation to turn this random variable into just a number. Now, the key issue is that this FDR is not observed, so we have to estimate it. And this is where there's a bit of disagreement on the estimation method. The method that I like to use is I like to take advantage of weak dependence, as I argued in the 5-slide main results. Under weak dependence, the FDR is going to converge due to the law of large numbers. To see this, you could rewrite these expressions in terms of shares. But once you have these shares, you're going to get an extra term here. But this all the second line does is just multiply and divide by n, basically. And then shares will converge to probabilities as long as the law of large numbers holds. As long as you have weak enough dependence, as long as T-stats that are far away from each other in some sense are unrelated, then you'll get this you'll get that simple expression. And this is well known in the multiple testing statistics literature going back to 2003. So all I'm doing in this paper is I modify this formula with a publication bias penalty. Like I was mentioning, this is the p-value. In the denominator is the right tail of the empirical data, but the empirical data is biased. So we need to do something like look at a random mining experiment to adjust for publication bias. So HLZ take a different approach. They don't want to assume weak dependence, or I don't know what they want, but they don't assume weak dependence. They focus on this arbitrary dependence assumption, make no assumption about dependence at all. And then Benjamin and Yakutieli in this very foundational paper, they show that the FDR can be controlled even though you have no assumptions. Even though you don't even assume the law of large numbers, you can control the FDR as long as you include this correlation penalty. And this is called to get a little bit of intuition for what this object is. The I in the denominator, it's basically one possible realized value of the number of discoveries. And so if you it turns out if you sum over all the different possible number of discoveries, you'll get an upper bound on the FDR. And HLZ emphasized this correlation penalty instead. And it's just by coincidence that these two penalties are similar. This publication bias penalty, it's 1 divided by the share of randomly generated T-stats that are greater than 2. Well, not completely random. The share of accounting T-stats, accounting-based strategies that have T-stats greater than 2. The correlation penalty, if you use n about 300, which is what HLZ used, you get you sum these things up and you get a 6.3. There's no reason why these numbers are similar. So it's kind of a coincidence that those two FDR estimates that I showed you previously are similar. It just kind of happens to be this way. But this kind of raises an important question, which is that if you include both penalties, then the data could be consistent with the idea that most results are false. That is, you can show that this is a legitimate way to calculate an upper bound on the FDR. You multiply by both the publication bias and the correlation penalty, and you get an FDR maximum of 170%. And so, this upper bound is consistent clearly with like a 90% false discovery rate. And so this is kind of important, like this is a huge this could make a huge difference. Now, and moreover, following HLZ, others in finance do use this correlation penalty. And so we should check whether I should be using this correlation penalty too. And that's what I'll do in the rest of the slides. And as I showed, weak dependence is the key question. If you have weak dependence, the correlation penalty is not needed asymptotically because of the law of large numbers. Now that begs the question, does this work empirically? We can check, is this dependence sufficiently weak? If you imagine that all these anomaly portfolios, they're maybe highly correlated with the business cycle, perhaps this, even when they're far apart, they still have dependence. Also, you may wonder if the sample sizes are large enough given how noisy stock returns are. We can check this with estimations on simulated data. But first, before I do that, I feel the need to clarify something. In case you read HLZ very closely, you'll find this sentence that in the original work, they set this this constant equal to 1. And under this choice, the algorithm is only valid when test statistics are independent or positively dependent. And with our choice, with HLZ's choice of that harmonic sum, BHY is valid under any form of dependence. In other words, if you read HLZ and take it literally, you might think that omitting the correlation penalty is only valid under independence or positive dependence. And clearly, neither of those assumptions hold for anomalies. And so you have to do this harmonic sum. But this passage has an error. So please, if you read this, don't get off track like I did. And if you have that feeling that you need to cross it out like I do, you have to cross. I don't know. Omitting the correlation penalty is valid under independence or positive dependence. It's sufficient. Independence and positive dependence are sufficient. They're not necessary though. Okay, so back to verifying weak dependence. Let me describe how I do this. First, I simulate a model of biased publications with correlations that closely match the data. Then I extrapolate the unpublished Tstats following HLZ, fit an exponential distribution, and find the publication bias penalty. Remember, the penalty is going to be something like, this area down here, dividing by that. Then you calculate the FDR bounds without the correlation penalty, and then we check that the bounds actually bound the FDR. If this works, then there's no need for the correlation penalty. For the correlation data, I'm using the Chen and Zimmermann open source dataset. This dataset successfully replicates the vast majority of the cross-sectional literature. That is, clear predictors have t-stats greater than 2, likely predictors have t-stats that hover around 2, and then for indirect signals, we don't know what they're supposed to do because the original paper doesn't tell us what's supposed to happen, and not predictors successfully replicate in that they don't predict. And you can find all of this information on GitHub, including how we categorize these predictors. So the reason why we use this Chen-Zimmermann data is to have these epsilons are bootstrapped from there. I demean the returns and bootstrap these epsilons so that the correlations in the model and the data are almost the same. Then in this model, we need to specify how true and false predictors behave. False predictors need to have a mean of 0 in order to fit the Benjamin E. Hochberg framework. True predictors will just say that they have a constant return of gamma. T-stat is computed using 200 months. This is a bit of a conservative assumption since most studies have more than 200 months of data, but this will get at that asymptotic approximation. And then only large t-stats are selected for publication. And this is just a staircase function. It just looks like that, where over here is t good. So that says that once you have a t-stat that's past t good, then no one really cares about how big it is. That's already good enough. Here's the simulation results. So I plot the actual FDR as a function of the t-stat hurdle, and you can see that the exponential fit reliably puts an upper bound on it. And it does so in the extreme FDR setting, except for maybe a little wrinkle here, which I think is numerically not important. I want to mention that in both of these simulations, the actual selection bias is much worse than is assumed. The actual t good, the actual good enough t-stat in the simulation is 5, but I'm using the estimator assuming that it's much lower at t good, but that still doesn't seem to make a big difference. And in the extreme FDR setting, almost everything here is false, but still the balance work. In other words, we don't need to do both penalties, and we could rest assured that that the FDR is less than 30% or so. In other words, most claimed statistical findings are true. Just to wrap up, I show that most claimed statistical findings in cross-sectional return predictability are likely true. It's just that the standard normal tail in the numerator is way too thin compared to this fat tail in the data, whether you use randomly mined counting variables or you look at the published data. Either way, you get an FDR of at most 25% or so. Hopefully, I can not sure if I should squeeze these things in, but let me try. I want to just discuss very briefly the mounting evidence that predictors are largely true. As I mentioned, McLean and Ponte find that returns decay only by 26% post-sample and before publication. And the way to visualize this is with this figure from my paper in RAPS. These blue circles, if everything was false, these blue circles should line up around here. But instead, the blue circles line up still around the 45-degree line. So that's just a simple demonstration that most predictors are true, going back to McLean and Ponte, 2016. And I need to mention that the paper is only about statistical findings, but HLZ's argument is about research findings. And by any reasonable definition, research findings include the text and not just the t-statistics. So a lot of these papers make claims about marginal utility or risk preferences. And my paper can say nothing about those claims. And it could be that textual bias could be large. And in my opinion, that's an important question for future research. And that's all I have.
Okay, great. Thank you, Andrew, for fitting the time perfectly and for ending on a forward-looking note. And now let's turn over to Dacheng for the discussion. So the screen is yours for the next 15 minutes. And let me just remind everybody in the audience that the chat is open for your questions. We will get to that part soon enough.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to discuss this paper. Perhaps like the audience, I'm also very interested in the debate. And having to discuss this paper gave me a very good chance to review what has been done in this literature. And I'm very excited to share about my view on this debate. All right, so obviously from Andrew's talk, it's clear that we're having this arguments from two sides, supporting seemingly very, very different conclusions. But I would also like to mention that in addition to that, these two statements, both are taken from their abstracts, are actually, are kind of different in styles, right? So in Harvey, Liu, and Zhu, their styles are a little bit more broad and general. So they talk about research findings in financial economics in general, whereas Andrew Chen's paper is more specific. In terms of making this statement, he made it very clear that this paper is about statistical findings in the cross-sectional probability, predictability literature. So this is something that I noticed. So now let me first try to think about what Harvey, Liu, and Zhu has said in their argument to support that claim. So their argument is actually quite powerful and very simple, right? So if you think about it, they basically say the multiple attempts to find the statistically significant factors leads to the well-known multiple testing problem in statistics. I think this is generally, they're generally true. So there are hundreds of papers that try to publish and try to explain this expected returns in the cross-section. And there are many more of them that have been tried but did not make it to the publication. So as a result, they argue that the usual cutoff level 1.96 for statistical significance is inadequate. This seems to be true as well, because whenever you have a multiple testing problem, you have to worry about the T hurdle 1.96 or 2 is not sufficient. And then they continue to argue that a new factor needs to clear a much higher hurdle with a T statistics greater than 3.0. All right, so if you kind of review what have been argued, so I think, so HRZ continue to argue that most of the findings are likely false, but if you think about this logic very carefully, they actually rely on two seemingly true claims that, if I read it, I kind of believe in what they are saying as well, because I assume that 3.0 is a good benchmark T hurdle to guard against the false discoveries. Right, so which means that if you use 3.0, likely your FDR is going to be bounded by say 5%. So this is a pretty good T hurdle. And secondly, many discovered factors have a T statistic below 3.0. That's what I would believe as well. So maybe a large number of them are between 2 and 3. So you know, if you use a higher T hurdle, likely many findings would be wrong. So I think Andrew's argument goes beyond these two seemingly true claims, and you know, so it's trying to justify both of them. So in fact, you know, what he has done is a very careful analysis of the publication bias and the correlations among individual T statistics, right? So once you have done this, you would be able to have a very good estimate of the FTR and the T hurdle. But in the meantime, we also want to know, right? So if you have a very good FTR, fine, right? So you might not have any discoveries, right? So you still have to have a very good replication analysis of existing factors using the same data and the same method to help you recognize that you know, even if you're using a very high T hurdle, there are still lots of discoveries left over. Right, so those are two important things that I think Andrew's paper contribute. Not only this paper, but also his open, you know, open asset pricing agenda that essentially help him build a help us build a very very good, you know, factor database using exactly the same data and the same method. So this is quite impressive. And in the end, you know, based on his analysis, Andrew argued that it seems that the majority factors meet a sufficiently high T hurdle that guarantees a low FDR. So as a result, you know, he actually argues most of the findings are likely true. All right, so this is I think what's going on, and it's very clear. The talk, the methodology. So I don't have much to say about this paper. So I'm just gonna say that I really like what has been done, and I particularly like the simplicity and the creativity of the methodology, right? So if you read the paper, I highly recommend, by the way. So you can see how smart Andrew is, and it's kind of clearly written everywhere in the paper. I also like the math is very elegant. As you can see, it's done by five slides, and despite that there might not be fully rigorous. So, you know, I understand this is not a econometrics paper. It's more like applied econometrics paper. So I might, if I have time, I'll briefly mention a few things in the end of my discussion. And I think this is a very thorough and careful empirical analysis. All right, so in my view, this paper could be published as a standalone article in a very decent journal. But right now, it is this current writing style reminds me of a very critical comment, aka referee report for HRZ. I think this is perhaps not necessary. So of course, it's up to you to decide you want a full article or a comment. But the current writing style reminds me of a comment. So so that leads me to kind of discuss a comment which is a little bit usual. So I'm not gonna you know, pick up any debate or argue with either side, maybe to your disappointment. So instead, I'm trying to offer some tangential thoughts. All right, so and maybe to kind of clarify what is debated and what we learn from this debate, what is the scope of the debate, and etc. So this is what I plan to do in the next maybe 10 minutes. All right, so first of all, let's kind of trying to dive deeper into what has been done, what kind of evidence has been provided, and trying to understand what the debate is about, right? So even though the debate, broadly speaking, is about replication crisis, which is a very big title, very eye-catching debate, but in the end, you know, the evidence we have seen so far mainly focus on the risk premium of characteristics sorted portfolios. And we know from asset pricing theory that any, you know, anomaly or factor or whatever you want to call it, correlated with SDF should have a non-zero expected return, right? So in other words, if F is correlated with SDF, you know, it should earn a non-zero expected return or risk premium. And if F plus epsilon is kind of if epsilon is not too large, you should also learn a high expected return because it's also correlated with SDF. So therefore, it's not surprising to have over 300 priced anomalies or portfolios, So because as long as it's correlated, and this is not surprising. We are already seeing tons of value-related factors or portfolios in this database. So from this point of view, this paper is not really about the problem being discussed. It's not really about another very interesting, exciting topic on zoo factor problem, right? So the zoo factor problem is mainly about which factor truly has a non-zero SDF loading, or in other words, which factor really contributes to the optimal portfolio. And that is another $1 million question, but this is not exactly what being discussed, right? So however, most of the published papers in fact claim more than the risk premium results, right? So they typically claim that their proposed factors are part of the SDF. So this is actually an even bigger claim. And actually the two are not identical, and they're not sufficient and necessary with respect to each other. You could have factors that are part of the optimal portfolio, but that have zero risk premium. It is part of that portfolio because of the risk hedging, reasons, etc. So, but in any case, to address the replicability issue and curbs the proliferation of factors require more than multiple testing techniques, right? So we need to think about model selection, for example. All right, so this is kind of one thing to clarify what's being debated and what the other papers are trying to argue. So now I'm trying to think about why we're doing this, right? So why we learn what we learn from testing risk premium of many factors jointly, right? So this is what multiple testing is about, right? So if you think about from economic point of view, a typical theory is written in the form of a model that predicts a handful of different statements. So this is certainly not a multiple testing problem. All right, but maybe the reason we're doing this is we're trying to test the predictions of many theories altogether. Well, then okay, that's fine. But then the problem is, how do we reconcile the findings that many incompatible economic theories are all likely true, right? So many of these theories argue that the first order variable is liquidity or intermediate capital or something else, right? So or value, so how do we reconcile, if most of the findings are likely true, then how do we reconcile these theories? So I think we might not have a replication crisis thanks to Andrew's work, but it seems that we run into an interpretation crisis. All right, so this brought me to think a bit deeper about what is the objective of what this paper tries to achieve, right? So, maybe finding factors do not really tell us much about economic theories. At least doing multiple testing approach of testing risk premium do not tell us much about economic theory, but maybe, it can benefit investment, right? So, as a real world investor, I would care about, which factors or which characteristics have non-zero risk premium. So then actually there is an issue here. So because FDR control in multiple testing, if you think about this, is actually a statistical objective. It is not directly related to the investment objective, right? So in other words, does good FDR control necessarily translate to good out of sample investment outcome in economic terms? The answer is actually no. Right, so intuition is FDR control is a very conservative objective. We can come up with a DGP, we can come up with a data generating process such that the individual predictability could be also weak that FDR control method finds nothing. However, it is still possible to combine these weak strategies together and eventually get a desirable out of sample performance. All right, so and Andrew's paper, of course, also mentioned other issues related to that multiple testing of risk premium does not really kind of give us any investment benefit because of potential issues like transaction costs, liquidity, and etc. So I think this is another thing that I would like to mention a bit. And then finally, I think the replication issue in finance likely exists. all right, even absent the multiple testing concern, right? So, recently there is kind of like a very interesting crowdsource project or experiment, the FinCap, and in this experiment, 164 teams from around the world test the same set of hypotheses, right? Including, for example, is market efficient, all the same data. All right, so, and the teams have zero incentives to do data mining. All right, I was part of this. I was part of the team, and one of these teams. I find this experience very interesting. So I can share with you lots of firsthand experience about this. But there is no selection bias due to the publication process, right? So in other words, this setting, it's actually not really a multiple testing thing. But the conclusion is quite interesting, or surprising in some sense. Essentially the conclusion is the evidence generating process. All right, in other words, the whole paper writing process is very, very noisy, potentially due to differences in execution, in models, in methods, which all lead to the so-called non-standard errors that create large enough room for researchers to obtain very, very different results. And ex ante, teams all underestimate the non-standard error. So we were actually quite surprised at how large it is, right? So in other words, not everyone can replicate every paper. And there are lots of issues, there are lots of reasons for that. We might just have to accept this fact. All right, so that's why I am saying that non-standard error is certainly relevant in the current exercise, and it matters more broadly in asset pricing, right? So for example, just to address the question of whether factors have risk premium, we have to think about which stock universe to consider to build the portfolio, how to handle missing data, how to winterize or standardize characteristics, how do we construct a complex characteristics if it depends on many other accounting variables, how do we select different samples for training, validation, and testing if we're relying on some other methodology to do so? So there's lots of questions, and some people use AR1, innovations, etc. So there are many different choices, and it's I have to admit that Andrew has done a great work to replicate many others papers, many other authors' papers, but not all of us can actually do that, right? So there is. Unfortunately, some replication issues that perhaps have to exist in the literature. Now, let me comment on some statistical issues in the current paper. So I think the paper argues that the BH method remains valid for FDR control with weakly dependent T statistics as N increases. So this is actually, in fact, quite a true statement. I think to justify this, you need to look into a statistical literature to understand some asymptotic arguments that supporting this supporting this claim. If you read the classical literature on BH method, etc., they're all like finite sample analysis, which is hard to actually generalize in recent days. But the derivation largely ignores the influence of sample size T on T statistics, right? So remember, the T statistics are based on based on certain sample. So when we think about the derivation, we kind of Andrew kind of ignore T and focus on N, but these two are actually quite related. So I would recommend a paper by Liu and Michał in Annals of Statistics 2014, which is exactly addressing this statement on the weak dependent assumptions, and let N and T both go to infinity. And in fact, it shows that log N has to be small relative to T to the power of 1/3. All right, so in other words, because of the limitation in the sample size, you just cannot apply multiple testing to an exponentially large number of tests that you want to do. There is a limitation in order for FDR control to be valid. All right, so this is a very powerful statement. It's actually quite interesting paper. So in other words, in simulations, the number of multiple tests should be much smaller than this number, which is around 347. I don't know how many, I couldn't find how many exactly multiple testing Andrew was doing, but just keep that in mind. There is limitations. And finally, this paper talks about correlations and its influence in FDR control. And I just want to quote from the stat literature that high correlations among statistics definitely lead to excessive conservativeness in BH procedure. All right, so in other words, you believe FDR is at 5%, but they actually give you 1%. So this is fine, right? So this actually helps you a bit, right? So it guarantees that the findings are most likely true. But in the meantime, you need to make sure that you have enough findings. You need to have a pretty good replication to have lots of findings that meet the bar, meet the threshold that was discovered. And also another consequence of high correlations is you're going to have high variance of the FDP. So FDP is what's inside the expectation of FDR. And if you have very high variance, the FDP, the FDR estimates is not really accurate. Anyway, so I would also like to mention that the low correlations among statistics of these long-short portfolios is not, in conflict with our prior knowledge that, market, there are lots of factors that could potentially lead to high correlations. So the reason you see low correlations is because the use of long-short portfolios. All right, so we know that a market is perhaps the only strong factor that explains all these things. And if you have long-short portfolios, market becomes weak, and that's why the correlations are not so strong, and which kind of justify the use of multiple testing. All right, I think that's all I want to say. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Dacheng, for the rich discussion. Andrew, is there anything you would like to follow up on in the next minute or so?
Yeah, sure. No, I appreciate those comments. They're really helpful. I think I struggle a lot with whether I should make this paper a standalone paper or a critique. The critique kind of helps it get attention, like my advisor is Lu Zhang, so he taught me that the best way to get attention is to start a bit of a conflict, although I don't always follow his advice. And also the Liu and Xiao paper is super interesting because it doesn't seem like it seems like my N is too large, but the simulations seem to work okay. So we'll have to see. I'll have to think about why that is. That's super interesting. On the non-standard errors paper, yeah, it's very interesting to think about a meta study of this meta study. And how you could definitely come up with different answers that way when you have such a vague question like, is there a replication crisis? It seems like I think it's important to be precise. That's why I have such a long title. In biology, I used to work in biology, and we have very long titles in biology, and you eventually get used to it. And I think there's some value. Maybe we could all move toward that.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. So before I go give the floor to Alejandro, let me just quickly wrap up for those who need to leave at the 1 hour mark, and then we can continue with our chat. So thank you very much for following this series, for attending today's webinar. As mentioned, this is our last event for the season, but we will be back next year in March. So stay tuned for new announcements. And meanwhile, just wanted to point out that we are also running an annual conference on the same theme, Future of Financial Information. And submissions are actually open to this conference, to the next edition right now. So you still have until the 20th of December to submit.